All right, welcome again. So we're going to do 1 and 2 Kings tonight. So a quick review from the past. Actually we're going to conclude the Deuteronomic history tonight. That's the history that begins with the book of Deuteronomy, with the Jews escaping from slavery in Egypt, making it to Mount Sinai, where they make a covenant with God. They spend quite a bit of time in the desert on their way toward the Promised Land. And just before they get to the Promised Land, Moses dies. He sees it on the other side of the river, but he dies before they get there. Then in the book of Joshua, Joshua is the successor to Moses. He leads the people across the river into the Promised Land, and they decide where each of the 12 tribes should live. After about 20 years, Joshua dies. The next book is the book of Judges. A judge is more of a local military leader, not a judge like we think of today. Some of them are called minor judges, where it just gives like a paragraph about them. Some of them are called major judges, where we have more information about them. There's many judges that aren't listed at all, because each of the tribe probably had some of their own. That's a very violent book, because it's about the settling of the Promised Land and trying to keep it and fighting with the other peoples who were there. Then we got into 1st and 2nd Samuel, which originally was one long book. They just divided it into half. And Samuel is the final judge, who seems to have had influence in all 12 tribes. And the people want a king. He tells them, maybe it's not such a good idea. God is supposed to be your king. But they say we want a king like all the other nations. So he appoints Saul as the first king, who's pretty good. He's got some faults, but they always say David is going to be better. Saul is the first king. He dies in battle with 3 of his sons. David is the next king. And although he's got definitely some family problems, he's a good leader for the country, in that Israel has more land under David than they did at any other time, before or since. And the greatest time in Israel's history in the Bible is under David. He defeated the Philistines, and he gained the area of Jerusalem, which he made his capital. So toward the end of his life, he's building a place for himself to live in Jerusalem. He had asked Nathan the prophet if he should build a place for the Ark of the Covenant. They've just been traveling with him wherever they go. He's been told, well, your son will do that. Talks about some of the difficulties David had, many of his military exploits, and then it finished with some of the war heroes at the end of 2nd Samuel. So, as is often the case at the end of a book, the main character or hero of the book gives a summary of the good things that God has done for the people at the end. Moses did that in Deuteronomy. Joshua did that at the end of Joshua, and here David does it at the end of 1st King, or the end of 2nd Samuel. So, that's where we are so far. So, the history continues with what happens after David died. So, we go to the first book of Kings. Just like Samuel, it was a long book, so we eventually just divided it in half and said we'll call the first half 1st Kings, and we'll call the second half 2nd Kings. So, it begins with David dying of old age. So, we haven't had a whole lot of people die of old age yet. So anyway, it even says at the end of his life he can't keep warm, so they get a young lady to sleep with him to help keep him warm. And then when he dies, the question is, who's going to take over as the next king? So there's 2 possible answers. He's got more than one son. So there's 2 main candidates. And one is Adonijah, and it says that he has the support of Joab, who is David's general, and Abiathar, the priest. You have some of your main priests, so Abiathar is one of them. So he and Joab are 2 of the main people that support Adonijah. And then the other one is Solomon, whose mother is Bathsheba, the one whose husband was the soldier. she comes to David and says, I think it should be Solomon, and she convinces David of that. He also has the support of Benaiah, who will be the main leader of the military under Solomon, and Zadok, one of the priests. The successors were eventually called the Sadducees, and Nathan the prophet, the one who had told David that your son will build a place for the temple, or the temple for a place for the ark, and also the one who pointed out David's sin. Nathan is still alive. He also is on the side of Solomon. So the first chapter is about which one of those two is going to get to be the next king. And eventually Bathsheba convinces David that it should be Solomon, and he says it should be Solomon. But when that happens, you still have a little bit of, still has to be some efforts to secure the kingdom under Solomon. So that's what chapter 1 is about. In chapter 2, he does give Solomon some final instructions. Like, follow God. David always was big into that. David was faithful to God, only this God. So that is among his major instruction. He does have 2 final requests for Solomon to do, though, that we would frown upon today. But back then, he said, remember that Shimei guy, the guy that cursed David when he left Jerusalem that time, and his friend said maybe we should kill him, and David said, well, no, let's not, just maybe he's doing what he should do. Anyway, he promised not to kill that guy. So anyway, he tells Solomon, I promise not to kill him, so after I'm dead, you do it. and then the same thing for Joab, the military leader. But the reason is given that Joab killed 2 people that he wasn't supposed to kill. And David probably kept him around because he was a good leader of the army. But the other thing might be to make your kingdom secure, you need a military guy that's on your side, and Joab is probably on the other side. So you better, this Benaiah is going to be your leader, you better get rid of Joab. So anyway, there's 2 people to eliminate yet for among Solomon's first instructions. Solomon does not do much as far as killing people goes. And the reason for that is Israel's strong now. David has gained this area so that usually you only go to war if you think you can win. All right, so the countries around Israel aren't going to fight him now because Israel has become quite strong. So in chapter 2, then it talks about making the kingdom secure and a little bit of the intrigue there, but it's nothing like it was under David. So by the end of chapter 2, Solomon has become David's successor. Somewhere around 960 BC, maybe as many as 10 years before or after, but that's the general time period that we're talking about. What is Solomon supposed to be known for? Yeah, so especially early on, he was pretty wise, it says. So, and it comes from chapter 3, where it says that God asked him what he wants. And the point being that most kings would probably say power, or more land, or whatever, more money. But Solomon says, I want to be a good leader, I want to make wise decisions. So he asked for the gift of wisdom. So God is very pleased with that. And that tells us, yeah, wisdom would be a great gift for all of us. Hopefully we utilize the gift of wisdom that God has given us. And then you're very familiar with the story that illustrates his wisdom with the 2 women. 2 women both had babies, one of them died, one of them didn't, and when they argue over whose baby it is, they can't settle it, so he says, okay, cut the baby in half, give each half. And when he says that, the real mother, of course, would say, no, don't do it, she can have the baby then. And Solomon says, okay, this woman cares more, she's obviously the mother, so she gets the child. Okay.
It's on Little House on the Prairie, too.
Okay. And you were talking about
the same story.
You were talking about TV shows before. If you remember back in the 90s, Seinfeld had an episode like that, where Kramer and Elaine had a bike that they shared, and they couldn't decide who was going to get it. So they brought in Newman, the mail worker, and they argued about why I should have it. He says, okay, cut it in half and give each of you half. Elaine says, okay, fine. And Kramer says, no, don't cut up the bike, she can have it. So then Newman says, okay, wait, he cares more for the bicycle, so he can have it. So, and that was kind of funny, because as it was going on, you could hear the crowd, the audience laughing, because they knew what was happening, because it was following this story here. So anyway, that is from chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, it gives a list of his officers. And now for the next few chapters, it's going to say that, all right, it's time now to build the ark, or to build the temple, to house the ark of the covenant. And these numbers are rounded off, and they're obviously exaggerated, but again, numbers always have symbolic meaning in the Bible. So you see a lot of things that's 3, 4, 7, and 12, or multiples of them. Sometimes we even don't know what the symbolism might be in a given case, but those are the numbers most often used. So in chapter 5, he starts making the preparation for the temple. Hiram is the king of Tyre. Tyre is a neighboring country. He becomes friends with him because he needs lumber. There's not a lot of trees in Israel, but there is in Lebanon, the country to the north. So he makes an agreement with him to get a lot of lumber, and then it talks about how big everything is going to be, how he has to get laborers to do this huge undertaking. You got to go way up there and cut down trees and haul them way back to here and then build this temple. So it takes a lot of labor and a lot of time. And then in chapter 6, it talks about how they're doing this. When it gives the 480th year from the departure of the Israelites from Egypt, that's probably not quite that many years, but they figured 40 years for a generation, so they said it's been about 12 generations since we left Egypt at the time we're doing this now. And if you want to get into how big the temple was and what they built it of and what was all in there, chapter 6 tells you all that. And I think I've mentioned in homilies before, like on a church, that our churches are kind of modeled on the temple. Not the farther up you go, the holier kind of is, and the holiest is the Holy of Holies. In the very front, behind the curtain where only the high priest went once a year, where they put the actual ark. That was the holiest spot in the world. Kind of like for us, it's the tabernacle, which would have the body of Jesus. So it's the same way here. It's based on this, that as you go up, the altar of sacrifices in the front, but in the very front is the Ark of the Covenant, where they offer incense once a year. In the story of the conception of John the Baptist, it says that his father, it was his turn that year to offer incense to the Holy of Holies. So he goes back and does that, and he's there for a while, and they're wondering what's keeping him. Something must be happening. That's where he has a vision that says, you and your wife are going to conceive and have a son. You're supposed to name him John. So anyway, that's the New Testament part of relating to the temple. They also finished the palace. David had a place to live, but Solomon makes it bigger and finishes it off there in chapter 7. And then in chapter 8, they have a major celebration to mark the dedication of the temple. And Solomon even leads a prayer. So yeah, Solomon is even a little liturgical here, but again, yeah, it doesn't have to do a lot of military stuff because things are secure.
So how long did the temple that Solomon is building right now, how long did it last?
It lasted until 587 BC. So it lasted for 350 years or so. Maybe a little bit longer than that. So they're building it maybe around 950 BC. And the last thing we'll do tonight is its destruction. All right, so chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8 are about the building and dedication of the temple. In chapter 9, again it says, now, all right, we've got all this stuff, let's make sure that we do it right. Remember the God who got you here. And then the second half of chapter 9 is some other things that the king did. It says it took about 20 years for him to build the two houses, meaning the temple and then the palace where he lives. It does say in verse 15 that they used forced labor levied in order to build the temple. So remember, Samuel had said, you want a king, that's fine, but one of the things he'll do is, he'll need your sons to be in the army and all this, and he'll tax you heavily and all this. Yeah, this was a huge undertaking. It took lots of labor, so they had to get labor from the population and from some neighboring countries, and obviously finance it. It cost money. You've heard of the Queen of Sheba. They think that it's probably an area what is modern Yemen. They did have some female leaders in that area of the world back then. So anyway, it says that she comes, that she's heard about Solomon, and she comes and she's impressed with him personally, by his wisdom, and with the city of Jerusalem, especially these two fancy buildings that have been built under him. So she is impressed by that. The second half of chapter 10 talks about how much wealth Solomon has. Back then, a lot of times the neighboring country, in exchange for not invading them, they would give you tribute. It was called gold, silver, whatever. So they added that to their treasury. So things are going pretty well, very well for the Jews at the beginning of Solomon's time. Things start to go downhill in chapter 11. So the peak of biblical Israel is the last 2/3 of David's reign and the first half of Solomon's. And it starts to go down in chapter 11, and it says one of the reasons for that is Solomon had a lot of foreign wives. So it talks that he marries the Pharaoh's daughter from Egypt. That way those two countries won't go to war. You've got a marriage between leaders of two places. That was pretty common back then. It does say, though, that he marries other women from other places, and the reason that's bad is it says that he lets them worship other gods in Israel. And it gives examples of that for every king from here on. Solomon himself, they exaggerate the numbers. It talks about how many wives he had. Yeah, it says 700 wives and 300 concubines. Again, they use 7 and 3 very regularly. That's an exaggeration, but it means that he had an awful lot. And among those were people who convinced him to allow the worship of other gods in his kingdom. Religious toleration wasn't a good thing back at this time. All right, and that concludes what they call the first part of 1 Kings after chapter 11. Because in chapter 12 it says Judah and Israel to the time of Ahab. And the reason for that is Solomon, when he dies of old age, I think I wrote in your deal 922, my Bible says 931, so it's again trying to piece history together to try to figure out exact years. So sometime around then, he comes to the end of his reign, and the thought is probably his son Rehoboam will become the next leader. But by the time Solomon is dying, some people are complaining about this labor that they have to do for the government, the high taxes, all the things they have to do to help the king. And they start complaining about that. And in the northern part of the country, a guy starts to say, maybe we don't want to continue doing things that way. A guy named Jeroboam, who's in charge of the forced labor. Anyway, Solomon dies, and then Rehoboam, who is the successor, people come to him and say, are you going to keep this up, these policies up, or not? And he says, well, I'll come back in 3 days and I'll give you the answer. So he goes to his advisors. And it says the younger ones tell him, yeah, you need to listen to the people. They're getting tired of these policies of the forced labor and the high taxes and all this stuff. You should probably, if you take it easier on them, they'll follow you. And then he listens to some of the other advisors who tell him, no, if you do that, they'll take advantage of you. You need to be tough. So it says that he unwisely chooses the be tough approach. So he says, I'm going to be even tougher than my dad was. So when he says that, there's basically a secession. Kind of like in our country in 1861, we had some southern states secede from the Union. Here, it's the northern tribes that secede from the rest. They say, we're not gonna do that. We don't want Rehoboam as our leader. They go ahead and use this Jeroboam as their leader. So, in somewhere between 922 and 931, we no longer have a united Israel. Instead of one country, it now becomes two countries. The north is going to be called Israel, and the south is going to be called Judah. That was the largest tribe, and that was in the south. There is a story in there where a prophet has a coat, and he tears it into 12 pieces and gives 10 pieces to Jeroboam, symbolizing that 10 tribes are going to follow you. It sounds like that's way more, but it's reasonably close to half and half because Judah is the largest tribe and the city of Jerusalem is in the south. So the king, Rehoboam, will now be called the king of Judah instead of the king of Israel. And he will have these southern tribes. He will have the palace that his father built, be next to the Ark of the Covenant. He'll say, I'm the real successor of David because he was my grandfather. Up in the north, that is going to be called Israel, and their leader at the beginning is Jeroboam, and they do not have Jerusalem. So they have Shechem, Samaria, some of the main towns up there. When Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan is someone from Samaria. By the time of Jesus, the people in the south look very negatively upon those people from the north. They think that they're the real Jews in the south because you guys seceded from us a long time ago. So that is the beginning of the fall of biblical Israel when it divides into two parts. Now, Israel in the north, led by Jeroboam, and Judah in the south, led by Rehoboam. And it becomes a little harder to read the Bible now because it will talk about this king at the same time as this king. And the reason for that is that now we have two kings. So the only three kings of a united Israel were Saul, David, and Solomon. From now on, it branches off. There's going to be a king of the north and a king of the south. So, chapter 12, 13 talks about the rebellion there and how we have the two different parts. In chapter 14, we have one of Jeroboam's sons dies, so he's not going to be the successor. And now we're going to have reports. It's going to give a summary of all these kings. So you can imagine, what if we gave a summary of the 45 presidents of the United States? That's kind of what they have here. Think of it kind of like in our, it says there's about 3 of them that are good, and there's a few others that are okay, and the rest aren't very good. so anyway, that's kind of what a lot of people say. Anyway, that's what we get here. So when someone dies, the format's always the same. So if you look at chapter 14, verse 19, when he dies, it says, the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, with his warfare and his reign, are recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. That's the next books. When we're done with 1 and 2 Kings, it's 1 and 2 Chronicles, which cover the same events as 1 and 2 Kings, and even some of the other things. So there's nothing totally new in Chronicles, but they're basically tell you whenever a king dies. If you want to see if you can find out any more about him, check Chronicles.
That's kind of a recap?
But written by a different person. Chronicles is written by a different person than 1 and 2 Kings, but it gives a really quick history of the stuff that happened before David and Solomon, and then summarizes a lot of the things that the kings did. So, on the next chapter, it says Rehoboam reigned in Judah, so that's Solomon's son. He was 41 when he became king, and he died when he was 58, so he was king for about 17 years. All right, it had just said that Jeroboam was king of the north for 22 years. So, when somebody dies, for the next person, so chapter 15, verse 1, it'll say, in the 18th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Abijam, becomes king of Judah. Right, do the math, yeah, Jeroboam was king for 22 years, Rehoboam for 17, so in the 18th year, the guy in the north, this guy becomes king of the south. So that's not real easy. My Bible at the beginning has a really, really small print, but it's got all the kings on both of them in order. So if you wanted to know who was king at the same time, you could actually look and see that.
That's your homework for next week.
It's nothing, most people aren't gonna remember the names, obviously, because there's a lot of them. It's like this guy, he's only king for 3 years. There's a few that aren't king very long, because they either get killed or they die, and anyway. But it always gives a brief summary, so it'll talk about how somebody or some country did evil in the sight of the Lord, meaning that they worshiped other gods. It says they built things in the high places. Okay, why are high places bad? The high places are places up in the mountains where they often built altars to other gods. It's where the Canaanites had what they did. They built things in the high places to their gods. So the high places are always looked upon negatively by the writers of the Bible. And whenever it talks about sacred poles or pillars, those are other things that pagan religions do. So we're not supposed to do those. One of the good ones is Asa. So in chapter 15, verse 9. So after Rehoboam dies, his son is king for 3 years, then he dies. Then it says, so now we're in the 20th year of Jeroboam, the king of the north, Asa becomes king. And it gives a little bit about his family. And it says he was good, like his father David. He got rid of temple prostitutes. He removed idols. He got rid of objects for Asherah. Asherah is one of the foreign gods. He burned these idols to other gods. He didn't get rid of the high places, but other than that, he did a really good job.
So he got rid of his grandma? His grandmother?
Yeah, he deposed her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's-
So did he pose or did he?
No, if he'd have killed her, it would have said he killed her.
Oh, so he just took her from authority.
Yes. And it says the reason for that is, as queen, she had made an object for Asherah. So she had made an idol to a foreign god. All right, and then it talks now, we're even to the point of Judah and Israel even fight each other. So, these used to be 12 tribes united, now sometimes they even fight each other. So that's sad. Again, so when Asa dies in verse 23, the rest of his act, with all his valor and accomplishments, the cities he built, check the book of Chronicles. And then here in the Chronicles it says, yeah, he had infirmity in his feet before he died, but anyway, and then he's buried in his forefathers' city of David. Both Bethlehem and Jerusalem are referred to as the city of David, because that's where David was from, that area, and then that's Bethlehem, and then Jerusalem, where he served as king. So then it talks about now conflict between the two sides. It does often say, though, that the northern tribes are much more likely than they really go off to worshiping other gods. So at the end of chapter 15, it says, Baasha begins a 24-year reign. All it does for him is said he did evil, imitating the conduct of Jeroboam and the sin he had caused Israel to commit, that sin being allowing the worship of other gods. Okay, so it talks to him, then,
16, we're end of 15.
yep. And then, so all these were, so yeah, look at chapter 15 was the reign of Abijam, the reign of Asa, the reign of Nadab, the reign of Baasha. Chapter 16, the reign of Elah, the reign of Omri, the reign of Ahab. So all these people are kings of one or the other. So again, we have two kings at a time. And then, now we start to get some really bad ones. So Zimri comes along in the middle of chapter 16. There's a conspiracy during his time that it talks about. But anyway, so it doesn't say, but it says he died because of sins he committed, doing evil again, sinful conduct of his predecessors. Omri reigns for 12 years. He bought the hill of Samaria, but he did evil too. It says even in verse 16:25, he did evil in the Lord's sight beyond any of his predecessors. imitated the sinful conduct of Jeroboam and even did more than that with their idols. Then Ahab becomes a king at the same time as Asa, who was one of the good ones in the south. Ahab becomes king of the north, and it says he does even the worst of all. You know who Jezebel is?
Mhm.
What do you know about Jezebel?
She's supposed to be mean.
Yeah, we'll see why. At the first, she's just called evil because she is married to
Oh.
Ahab, and she convinces him not only to allow the worship of her gods, but convinces him to worship her gods.
She means altar to Baal.
Yeah, Baal is the main god of the area, the local area. So a lot of times, so it's Yahweh versus Baal a lot of times. So she convinces her husband to give up his faith in this God that had brought them to this land to follow her God. So that's the first reason why she's considered, she convinces her husband to follow her God instead of the one that they've been following for so long. We'll see later on what she does to enhance her evil reputation. So we stop there and we pause and we tell a little bit about prophets. Prophets meaning the two main ones at this time, Elijah and Elisha. Later on, so there are prophets at this time. They even have their own books. We'll do them next. So is there anybody saying, you shouldn't be doing these bad things that are going on? Yeah. Prophets have been saying that. We'll hear from them later. So, the early prophets don't have books named after them, though. We heard of Nathan a little bit. We're going to hear quite a bit about Elijah and Elisha, two of the most powerful prophets. They are the two most powerful prophets of the Old Testament, but they do not have books named after them. They are characters in 1st and 2nd Kings. So we start, the first we hear about Elijah begins in chapter 17. You've heard of him a couple times in Sunday readings, right? The one with the widow. He stays with this widow and she thinks they're all going to starve, her and her son. And Elijah says, bring me something to eat, or bring me some water and a piece of cake would be good. And she says, well, yeah, then we'll eat and then we'll die because we're running out of food. And Elijah says, no, that won't happen. And her and her son are able to live a long time because of their generosity is rewarded and they don't run out of food. There's a drought, and whenever there's a drought, which is certainly not uncommon in that area of the world, food and water are always a problem. The most known story of Elijah is chapter 18 with the scene on Mount Carmel, which is a mountain, not in the range, but kind of off by itself, very well-known place.